Welcome everyone, this is Maria speaking. I'm the showrunner and I'm here to share a few LinkedIn Live pointers to get you started. Please take this time to share this live stream with your network and to invite your friends and colleagues to this event. We will be recording this discussion and we will include the link in our summary post on LinkedIn, as well as in our One Burning question group. Feel free to follow me and all of the moderators and panelists here today, and be sure to check out and follow others in the room. We love hearing from our audience, and we invite you to join the conversation by sharing your thoughts and questions in the comments below. While we might not be able to bring you to the screen, we'll highlight and address as many of your contributions as possible. If we run short on time and cannot highlight every comment, we will make sure to address them afterward. It is now my pleasure to turn the floor over to the moderator, Christine Von Raesfeld, and the rest of the team, who will be introduced by her.
Christine, I'm not hearing you.
My goodness, I'm sorry. I started out on mute. So good morning, good afternoon, wherever you all are. My name is Christine Von Raesfeld, and I'm excited to welcome you all back to our clinical trials One Burning Question. As a patient who's navigated the complexities of clinical trials, I understand firsthand the challenges and opportunities we face in this ever-evolving landscape. I know how crucial these trials are in our lives. Recently, we've been facing significant challenges due to financial cutbacks in clinical trial operations. These cutbacks are more than just budget adjustments. They directly impact the care we receive and the pace at which new treatments are developed. From delays in accessing groundbreaking therapies to the reduced availability of trials, the ripple effects are far-reaching. As a patient, I'm worried about how these funding cuts will delay access to new treatments and reduce the number of available trials. I'm also concerned that the quality of care patients receive might be compromised, leading to higher out-of-pocket costs for individuals who may not be able to afford them anyways. Lastly, I'm worried about the potential safety risks due to the reduced oversight in trials. This brings us to our one burning question for today. How are funding cuts disrupting the landscape of clinical trial operations? I encourage each of you to share your experience and insights. Whether you're worried about the quality of care, the increased costs, or the ethical implications, we want to hear from you. To help us explore this topic, I'll be joined by my co-moderators, Jackie Blem, President at Cardiff Clinical Consulting, Inc., Jennifer Bonfrisco, Clinical Trial Operations Expert within the pharmaceutical industry, Taya Romero, Alliance and Relationship Management Consultant, Michael W. Young, Principal and Founder, BioMedWorks Life Science Consulting, and Elizabeth Dreicher, Co-Founder and CEO of Consuli, our host. For those that don't know yet, Consuli is a public benefit company, a B Corp, with a mission to enable individuals to participate in the data economy. Experts suggest that our individual health data is worth $20,000 per year. Consuli helps people choose who gets access to and how their personal information is used, and if and when desired, get them paid for their data and can make medicine better. Consuli does this by operating a marketplace for members where Consuli becomes their agent. Members receive a smart matched individualized offers from Consuli for opportunities, including to participate in clinical trials and data trials. There is no cost for individuals to join the Consuli movement. Consuli offers sponsors of data and clinical trials a unique opportunity to find and reach individual members. You can learn more at consuli.net, and individuals can readily join, and sponsors can fill out the contact form to indicate their interest in exploring a relationship. Maria will be posting a link in our comments, and you can feel free to go there and check them out. So next, I am going to turn this over to Elizabeth. And Elizabeth, I'd like to begin by asking you to help us set the stage for this conversation.
Thank you so much, Christine. Happy to do so. Yeah, reflecting on this important question, I started to think from a macroeconomic perspective the broad theme here is that for the foreseeable future, we're going to have to be even more thoughtful and exercise more ingenuity to move forward with potentially less funding. I think that is the reality. And so it's a grand design challenge. And we're all going to need to figure out how to advance in this new world order with a new set of philosophies around funding for research. That's one of the core new macro themes that we all understand. And concurrently, we are in a moment in history where AI and all that is enabling is the second core theme of our time. And thinking through that, what is AI really? It's a new tool, and perhaps just in time for this design challenge that we are facing in this realm. One facet is that it's an efficiency tool. There's lots of ways we've discussed in the past in this one burning question that I know is all over. It's hard to open any newspaper, open any news feed, and not hear about AI, right? This is the moment that we are. So it's a facet that is going to directly potentially align with the broad cost cutting that is now before us. And then, in the research enterprise, this is no surprise to all of you that are here. This is an enterprise that typically takes a long time and is terribly expensive for everyone in society. It's expensive from a drug development and company perspective. It's expensive from a government perspective, both as a funder of external research and a conductor of internal research. And it's terribly expensive for the research enterprise. And I want to bring attention to that. When I talk to provider site CFOs, many share that the medical research arm, when looked at from a purely economic point of view, is a money loser for a lot of enterprises. So meaning they don't get paid enough to do the work. And one could simply say that the juice is often not worth the squeeze. Just from that bean counter perspective. So one might ask, why do largely academic and provider institutions do all this medical research? And one might hear things like to attract prestigious researcher physicians and ultimately to attract individual patients to their provider institutions. We all know names like Mayo, Stanford, Cleveland Clinic, Vanderbilt. We know those because you perceive that these institutions have prestigious, smart, excellent, good doctors and researchers, and that you're going to get better care, right? So this research enterprise from a bean counter perspective is often a loss leader in order to get the uptake of being a preferred provider in the ecosystem. So turning our attention to the macro theme here and why we're here today, I think that for us to realize that in the grand scheme of things, these perceived quick, large budget cuts are a result of the finance people basically doing the calculus. They're telling us by their cuts that they don't have confidence in the research programs financially. And that's really important from a signaling perspective in the market. And yes, we could say, well, research is not all federally funded, yet federal funds are often subsidizing the largely episodic research programs and inadequate payments of the market actors. And this is in part why the research admin fees are so high and all the vexing conversations about that. So if I'm a research institution, I've got to recoup my money somewhere, and that is a place where it's occurring. So, in closing, we're migrating from this slow, expensive enterprise to what we need to get to is a less expensive and arguably faster enterprise for all the reasons of the medicines and the cures that frankly all of us need. And I think we're at a moment where we also have to ask ourselves around, issues of reciprocity. Is it fair for the government to subsidize the inadequate fairness and payments of the private sector? And how do we get to a more equalized scenario that takes inventory of fairness writ large, including for the participants that are in the research enterprise. And with that, Christine, I will turn the floor back to you. And you're muted.
I am off of my game today, but thank you all for sharing it to me. So Elizabeth, thank you for that and for that update, and I appreciate that overview. Jackie, I want to move to you first. And so given your extensive experience in clinical consulting, how do you see funding cuts impacting the overall management and execution of clinical trials? And what strategic adjustments would you recommend to mitigate these challenges?
Yeah, so I'm going to give you my observations as a clinical operations person, more on the industry, and I probably even can provide what it would be like on the CRO side. So certainly with all of this stuff happening very quickly, there's a lot of uncertainty that's been introduced into our awareness. And of course, if you have uncertainty, that means that things are going to go slow down, and that's affecting timelines. When you affect timelines, you affect cost. Elizabeth kind of talked about the vacuum that is being created. And I was with colleagues last night and we were talking about that, and it's going to be interesting to see how that vacuum is going to be filled. We certainly do predict from clinical operations that we're going to see a rise in overhead costs. Where we were seeing overheads of 35 to 50%, it's gonna continue to grow. On the industry side, for sponsors, there's going to be uncertainty for investors. We're just not sure what's going to happen with venture capital to fill in that gap. And so we're going to have to see how that goes. And not just for sponsors, but I would also say for vendors. For the first time in my career, I am seeing so I've had a couple of labs that are, having difficulty, and I've lost a couple of vendors just recently. So funding is going to be affected. Then I'm talking about what I'm seeing at clinical sites. With startup, we may see increased timelines for startup. And I'm not currently in that situation right now, but we are very concerned about enrollment, and that is both from a patient perspective as well as resourcing at the clinical sites. And then we are hearing about data getting moved around with potentially outside of the realm of HIPAA. And so, that just might impact, how data is entered and that accuracy of the data. Recently there have been headlines about major layoffs at some of the larger institutions. And so there's some concerns there about what happens with the data, which also not only has an impact on timelines and cost, but also our most important task is to ensure safety. So if the data isn't there, if the people aren't there to collect it and enter it into the database, which is for us on the sponsor side where the rubber hits the road, we have to be really cognizant that there might be some safety issues. And then the third observation I want to point out is that just patients have always been a little bit wary about clinical trials, and so now we've introduced some insecurity about their data, the blood and tissue collection that we have. And again, first time in my 30 years of doing clinical trials where I have patients that are saying, no, you can't have extra tissue, you can't have extra, blood samples. So I don't give my permission to do that. And it's certainly their prerogative to do that. But I think that there's just have been a little bit more uncertainty entered into our atmosphere. So what to do? I have some suggestions, and this is something that is going to be very dynamic, and we're going to be exploring this. But I think that we will have to be very diligent in our study setups. We have to just make sure that we have a very good foundation as we get going. We have to do, we might want to use larger providers that are very stable, we might want to consider, a larger CRO, larger labs, just to make sure that you have the stability. This is just a suggestion. I'm not sure, how that really, what if that's something that everyone wants to implement. It's not a one size fits all suggestion. I think that you want to be really diligent about doing audits and making sure that you fully understand the sites that you're going to be working with, the vendors that you're going to be working with. Sometimes, just to be honest, sometimes we do that just to make sure that we are kind of covering our bases for the audit. But here we really want to make sure, and this is my last strategy, we want to make sure we're using very experienced people that really know how to look for the red flags and really dig in and just make sure that these processes are not box checking exercises. So I think it's really important to make sure that you have good experienced people, whether you're talking about auditors, the vendors that you're working with, just to give yourself a solid foundation so that as you do go with this uncertain time, you have a good path forward.
Thank you. And I appreciate that. I saw Michael shaking his head in agreement the entire time that you were talking. And for those of you on the data side of it, we also have a data dignity conversation. So that some of the points that you addressed there, we are bringing up in that conversation. So Jennifer, I want to move over to you for a second. And as someone running clinical trials within the industry, what are the primary concerns and changings that you are beginning to see regarding these funding cuts?
Thank you. I want to echo what Jackie had said. And one of the things I kind of didn't plan on talking about today, but as you brought it up, Jackie, I think the VC money has really affected our industry in a big way. Last year, I was working for a tiny little biotech that I absolutely adored. And I mean, we were really at the 11th hour of getting a submission in, and VC money's just dried up and the company closed down. So, I mean, we are seeing that. We're seeing a change in the industry. A lot of the small companies they're having a hard time making it. So I think that's just a broad thing we're seeing overall in terms of cutbacks. So that's definitely affected us. 10 years ago, you went on LinkedIn and you put your plaque out and, you had an opportunity pretty quickly, and things have changed, and I think that's partially due to the change in the economy and the opinion about our industry, right? Because it's very expensive. We have a lot of fails, and it's a tough industry. But I think on the day-to-day of conducting studies, what I think I echo again, what both Jackie and Elizabeth had said, the biggest issue I'm seeing is at the site level. Just this morning, we were having a conversation about trying to go to one of the bigger institutions. And, I think most people know when we start a study, we have a budget. We have a budget of how much we can pay per patient, per site. And, everybody has budgetary limitations, no matter if you're Merck, Sanofi, everyone has a limit. And, we do too. So some of the bigger institutions, they're, like you're saying, their startup fees are getting higher. Their overhead is commonly 50%. I mean, we used to balk at 30%, but now we're seeing 50% like it's nothing. And, these studies are long and complicated. The study I'm running is a 30-week study. And when you add on a 50% overhead, it gets you out of the equation. We can't conduct studies there. So I think, that's what's really changed things, is that we have to be more intentional about where we go. And that, like you're saying at the beginning, really, it affects everything. It does affect patients, because guess what? If you're at Northwestern or you're at Mayo, we might not be able to do research there anymore, because we may have to go to a bigger balance of community centers and some of the academic centers. And I think the response to this is that as pharma and biotech, we have to be even more intentional than ever about deciding where we're going to go. You know, we'll always will have a KOL or two or three that we must go to. But we have to, and we've been talking about this for years, obviously, we have to go to high performing sites. And, you know, it can't just be, oh, grab the list, we'll go to Memorial Sloan, we'll go to Stanford, you know, because maybe we can't afford them. So I think the positive of this is that what we've been talking about for years, about having more diverse sites and having a balance of community and academic, it's really pushing us to look closer at that. Because the money's not unending, right? So we just can't do it. And I think that's the biggest thing I'm seeing, because I'm in a startup of a study right now, and you know, but otherwise, yeah, I think it trickles into all, like, even like Jackie said, we're seeing it trickle into our vendors, our labs, even shipping samples. You know, we've had a couple important blood samples that were shipped that got lost. You know, that's a big problem. You know, we run these trials, and the blood is pretty important, and it gets lost. So, you know, I think it's just causing us to work harder, be more intentional. The old, you know, it's not just a natural flowing thing like it used, like if it ever was, but it's causing us to manage trials even closer.
Well, before we move on, I want to say that I do see the comments in our chat here, and we will get to them, but we want to get to all of our moderators' perspectives before we bring that in. So, Taya, I'm gonna move over to you, and then we'll move to Michael afterwards. But Taya, from your perspective in alliance and relationship management, how can clinical trial organizations strengthen partnerships and collaborations to navigate the financial constraints imposed by these funding cuts?
Sure. I think what they're going to have to do is do a deeper dive into their relationships and really kind of tier out those relationships, creating a structure of what partnerships make sense and where they can align. I think we're going to see a lot more partnerships and collaborations, which we've already been seeing through announcements on LinkedIn almost on a daily basis at this point. You know, they're going to have to be reestablishing what shared resources they actually can commit to. And I think there's a lot of opportunities in this for building alliance networks, and like Jennifer, kind of adding on to what Jennifer said about looking at sites that are a different network than what we've looked at before. I think statistically, most trials happen in only 5% of the sites that are available. So looking at how to branch out and create partnerships there. You know, we're going to be looking at developing more communication channels for how these finances are going to be shared among these different companies. I think, you know, the VC issue, cutting funds from like the NIH programs, and all of that is going to be really pushing these relationships closer together, if that makes sense. And then they're going to be looking at ways to also share the burden. Like, how are we going to share this burden? And it's going to have to be more of a structured tier kind of process, because it won't make sense for every partnership to be 50-50, right? So they're going to have to really look and do a deep dive there.
And I'm loving the comments that are coming in on the chat here. So I encourage you all to engage and comment back. Michael, we saved the best for last. So from your perspective as a life sciences consultant, how do funding cuts influence the innovation pipeline in clinical trials? And what strategies can organizations employ to sustain innovation despite these limitations?
Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me into the conversation here. It's really interesting because of the client base that we have. We are struggling with, you know, existing companies who are dealing with exactly what we've all been talking about here, which is an acknowledged broken system. It has been not right for many decades, and the fundamental financial pressure that's coming now with various budget cuts ranging from the NIH all the way down to individual sites that you've all beautifully outlined is an existing paradigm that we're working with. And so I think part of what we've got to do, and the conversation that we're having with some of the startups who haven't yet gone into human clinical trials, is how are we going to deal with this? It's not going to be, business as usual. So if you take a look at this, and it's been said before that necessity is the mother of invention, and sometimes it's just a mother. So we've really got to deal with the fact that what we're talking about isn't going to change for the better. You may be hoping for a wicked solution here, but it won't change for the better. And so I think what we've got to deal with is take a look at what are the potential opportunities that are in here. And I see 3 that are looming on the horizon. And granted, it's not going to solve next week's or next month's trial issues here, but we've got to be looking at the horizon and try and do something about this. So the 3 opportunities that I see are clearly, is there an opportunity to really develop and apply some of the new ways of doing clinical trials? We already know that efficiency is at the bottom of all of this. Reworking the way in which we actually do trials means changes in the regulatory requirements. Do we really need all of the stuff that we're currently doing? All of you who have been doing work in the oncology side of things know that the number of clinical endpoints that are being collected today is literally 10 times what it was 5 years ago. Do we need all of that in order to get safe, effective medications? It's not an answer, but it's a question. And, can we use, Bayesian statistical approaches? Can we really put, decentralized trial construct into this and actually make it much more efficient? Are there ways in which, there are opportunities to revitalize the way the FDA is going to have to streamline all of this? So that's number 1, is, are there more effective and new ways to do trials? Number 2 is, we've talked a little bit about technology and the application of AI. Personally, my view is that AI is already revolutionizing a lot of the things that we are doing, but we're doing it largely in an efficiency and, as Elizabeth brought up, in a tool fashion. But the reality is that AI has an opportunity in here. I just posted recently to LinkedIn where a bot was calling to make wedding reservations at a hotel, and the hotel bot answered back and said, "You know what? I recognize that you're a bot as well. Let's move this conversation to gibber chat," which is their language, okay? And all of a sudden, they started talking together, and in the matter of 2 minutes, they solved the entire question without any human interaction. Now, it freaks us all out to see that kind of stuff, but the reality is there are ways in which we can expedite things and, in fact, make them more efficient and more accurate. Think about the use of in silico trials. Think about the fact that I've got a client that we're working with who actually has come up with a way to keep human tumor tissue alive for up to 8 weeks ex vivo. You could do all of your basket trials in that without ever having to recruit a single patient. So there's a lot of ways in which we can change the way in which we do trials by applying technology. So that's number 2. Number 3 is, I'll offer a little hope here. I think that there are new players and new funders that need to come into this and are coming into this. And I would ask you to think about the fact that we have all of these traditional pharmaceutical companies, many of whom I've worked for. And I can tell you that that has been the traditional source for sponsored trials, is all of their money. But think about the new sponsors that need to come into this. Companies such as Apple, Amazon, Microsoft. These are guys who have not traditionally supported actual clinical trials, but I think you're going to see them get more actively involved so that they can control the entire channel. There are clearly profitability objectives in all of this, but the fact of the matter is there may be money sources that we haven't considered. So just thinking a little bit more, maybe a year or so down the line, we've got to move this equation in a way that benefits the patients that we're so concerned about. Our goal here overall is not just to make more money or to do it less expensively, but the fact of the matter is we don't want to sacrifice the speed at which we're delivering trials. And the last thing I'll say about that is, while we typically have a much more US-centric view, if you take a look at what's actually going on in China right now, you're going to see that they are outstripping the Western world in terms of the way in which they're getting the trials done, they're getting them done faster, they're getting them done cheaper. There's got to be something we can learn from that. So I'll shut up for right now, but hopefully that's a little bit of glint of light.
Well, I appreciate that, Michael, and I do think we need to really examine how we're looking at things. We are at the halfway mark of our chat, and we've got an active chat going on the side and some questions for some of you guys. So if I can, I'm going to start with, I want to say it's Layla Coopersmith, and hopefully I did not mispronounce your name. But she wants to know, Jackie, do you agree the size of the vendor should match the size of the project and or sponsor size when small clinical trial sponsors hire large CROs and large vendor companies to manage or deliver aspects of their trials? They do not always receive the time and priority they need to achieve top quality.
Thanks for that question, Leila. So actually, that is absolutely been my paradigm for how I manage trials. I do select vendors and CROs according to the size of the project and the size of the sponsor, and even consider a little bit of the culture of the sponsor and the culture of the CRO as I know it, and just to make sure that there's a good chemistry and a good fit there. But having recently experienced the loss of some pretty major support vendors in my current trials, I want to consider maybe a paradigm shift. And I also see another question that's kind of related to that, which is kind of the devil's advocate question. So absolutely, I think that I want to stick to my foundation and create the lean. I always am focused on a lean and mean crew to get to execute a trial. But you have to start with a good solid foundation. So focus on the quality, get, do the due diligence to make sure that the vendors that you select not only have the quality, but, that they're going to be around for the next 5 years. For oncology trials, it might take that long. And just make sure that they are there and set that up. And if you start with that, I think you can move forward with a lean trial, but without compromising quality. But to go back to Layla's question, I think that there's still that shift, that paradigm shift to consider going forward.
And I want to get to all of you and get that devil's advocate question, but I also want to, Layla had a question for Jennifer as well. And so Jennifer, a lot of the higher performing sites tend to be targeted by the majority of sponsors, resulting in overburdening PIs and site staff with sponsors also competing for the same patients. What are your thoughts on working with site networks and a bit of clinical research, naive sites, but proven to be able to deliver the studies, have full available resources, staff, and patient populations, rather than being laser focused on sites that all sponsors are targeting?
Well, I think that's a great question. And it's funny because Taya and I were actually talking about this last night. Um, a high performing site is not necessarily always MD Anderson or Stanford. You know, I remember years ago I was working on a GI program. And, if you've worked on IBD, those sites are very, very competitive. It's very hard to get them. And I was at a Crohn's and colitis group event, and I heard about this one site in Louisiana, tiny little community site. And this guy was enrolling like gangbusters. So this site that nobody knew about 2 years ago was the high performing site. So the high performing site changes. It can be based on their staff. They can have a rock star nurse there or coordinator there, and that makes them the high performer. So it varies. I think we know who the KOLs are because they're at the medical conferences, they're at the podiums, but they're not always the high performers. So that's my point. I think it's important to shift our thoughts about who our high performing sites are. And, what Tay and I were talking about is, we always talk about research naive sites, and there was a push before, let's go to more research naive sites. But it's like, we say that, but then sponsors don't really want that. So I think we have to try to reshape that, to say, give them a chance because they are often your rock stars. And I do think that these SMOs or these site, management, I think SMO is a bad term nowadays, but these networks of sites can be very, very powerful. Also, sometimes what they'll do is they'll give you one agreed contract, which is beautiful. If you have a site network that says we have 20 sites, you just negotiate one contract with us, your startup process is much quicker. So site networks are phenomenal, but I think 10, 15 years ago, they became too big, they got a bad name, but they shouldn't. I think site networks are always interesting and worth exploring. But some of them still can be a problem. Some of them still will have huge overhead costs or monthly fees if they perform or not. So again, like everything, you have to look at critically.
Thank you, Jen. So we're going to go back to that devil's advocate question for all of you, because I know Jackie had a chance to answer. Do any of you have a response here where how are funding cuts forcing use to get creative and fix broken systems of clinical trial operations by getting lean without compromising quality, patient safety, and still delivering studies on time and within budget? Any of you want to take that first? Michael, you want to go for it?
I'm just going to simply say that, this is really the crux of today's problem, and I think it's a great devil's advocate question. I don't think anybody on this panel necessarily has the answer, but getting lean and not compromising quality is always a gas and clutch problem. It's and trying to struggle to make those kinds of things happen is just really block and tackle, get down to, it's get down and dirty or what's actually going in there into this. But I think that, Craig Lipset actually volunteered a really interesting thought about where there are hidden opportunities and efficiencies in the collaboration that's going to happen. And I think that, just speaking about this alone says we can find ways to streamline, we can find ways to expedite things, and I think that in many cases it is going to be a matter of priorities. As I mentioned before, you want to get to the point where we're doing the the things in the trials that actually make a difference. Yes, I grant you that a lot of times we're collecting data for possible future opportunities, but it is proven that that's now just slowing things up. And so we really, I think from the standpoint of the regulatory dossiers, need to be given more flexibility so that there are opportunities to actually accomplish some of this stuff. Because if you take a look at some of the inclusion exclusion criteria, it makes many of these trials almost impossible to recruit.
Yeah.
And we've seen, and I'm not saying dun down the science and leave room for errors. Got to remember that not until 1963 with the Kefauver Acts, drugs didn't even have to be effective; they just had to be safe. And so we're at a point where doing what's needed to be done in order to produce a safe and effective medication is really what we've just got to focus on.
Yeah, and actually I want to come back to, I think one of really important point is the point that Michael made, is it's regulatory requirements. And it's exactly that. I think a lot of people are still doing some of the old stuff because they think, well, we did it before, we better do it again. And also, we're still seeing the FDA sometimes ask for things that don't necessarily make scientific sense. We have topical drugs that we know have no systemic, absorption, and we're being asked to do extensive PK studies. I mean, that's happened to me twice in the last year, and one of them was in Africa. The cost to do a PK study in Africa for a drug that had no systemic availability was ridiculous. So, I mean, I feel like exactly it would be wonderful if we pushed back more on the FDA, if we had better regulatory strategy. That drives everything. It drives what we're doing. So.
And Taya, any thoughts on that? And I saw Darshan joined us. We're going to take Taya's thoughts on this. And Darshan, we're right at the mark for our closing remarks. And I know that you've looked over the question. So I do want to hear your perspective, but I wanted to get to Taya really quick on any thoughts that she might have on that question of the devil's advocate question that we got.
Sure. I think I agree with everyone's comments. And I think doing a deeper dive into the regulatory and what is actually required, a lot of the things we follow are just guidances. So they're not necessarily requirements, and kind of parsing out the difference. Something else I have noticed within the CRO and the vendor space is this kind of idea, we'll just offshore this. We'll lay off the US team, we'll lay off the European team, and then we'll offshore. It may save money short term, but long term, it's going to add time because it's a longer process working with teams offshore. Sometimes you have to update your SOPs. There's just a lot of work that goes into having a team offshore as well. So I think balancing that out, it can be helpful, but also you have to consider all of the consequences of that decision, which I think right now it's just kind of like sink or swim. So people are just doing as much as they can to save money in the moment, but long term, we may see some fallout from that.
So we are right on time for wrapping up. And before we wrap up, I want to get closing remarks from our co-mods, but also Darshan, your thoughts on the question quickly. And the question for all of us, it's how are funding cuts disrupting the landscape of clinical trial operations?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to come in and answer everything with one shot. So I'm going to try to do this as quickly as possible. I think a few different things. I actually just attended a conference where it was a bunch of clinical trial sites. They were all struggling with this exact same question. A few different things popped up. So number one, I think from an M&A standpoint, a lot of private equity companies are asking for additional endpoints. They're going to have to realize very quickly that those additional endpoints cost a lot of money. No one's funding those mandates. So how is that going to play out? So I think what may land up happening is adjusting of expectations. So I think that'll be actually really useful. The second thing is people have been pointing to those indirect costs, for example, and saying that these funding cuts are representative and they're going to affect things that are happening. And the truth is that's true except when you look at it, a lot of those indirect costs could actually be subsumed inside the direct costs. So I'm having conversations with people right now where they're saying, should this actually be a direct cost? Should this be reflected in the cost in the ICD-9 code, for example, in the CPT codes that you're dealing with, whatever you're dealing with, and put those in. Therefore, you just readjust the numbers. And that's not as difficult as one might think. Having said that, I think there were, for example, the argument about, sorry, I'm now switching from my lawyer hat to my pharmacist hat. You talked a little bit about this idea that patches, for example, or creams have no systemic availability. Unfortunately, there can be situations where they do have that systemic availability. And so how do you address that? That's sort of what the FDA is going, I don't know. You prove to me that it doesn't exist. So you're right. In many cases, that's not true. You add a protein, you're going to be actually 100% right. The moment you have a lipid, which a lot of these things are fat soluble, changes the entire gamut. And finally, I think there was the argument about guidances. It is non-binding. However, I think we have other additional issues that go along with it. For example, the Trump administration has basically come out and said that we aren't going to regulate by guidances. And you have the Loper-Bright case that said you can't regulate by guidances. So the FDA is in all new territory. It doesn't know what to do. I expect a lot of change. That's going to come from OIG, which is looking at payments, NIH, which is looking at payments, but FDA, that's going to have to recalibrate its own expectations. So how are funding cuts disrupting the landscape of clinical trial operations? It's one of the many, many things that the FDA is trying to deal with. I don't think money is the only thing. I think survival is one of the things they're looking at right now. So we'll see how it plays out. Thank you for the opportunity to talk.
Yeah. And Jackie, your closing thoughts or remarks here?
Yeah, so I'm just really grateful that we have a venue like this to share our thoughts, because I think that we're going to be moving into a time where, that collaboration, that support, that opportunity to share ideas about strategies is going to be so important. We had to get very innovative with COVID. That's pretty recent, and we've had other epidemics that we've had to work through as well. And I know we can do it, and it is really interesting to see how things get pushed along. So I'm very encouraged by that. But having these talks, just how we can be together and demonstrate our resilience together and share the strategies. I think that's just going to be really important to get through this.
Yep, I totally agree with you. Jen, closing thoughts?
Yeah, I think I agree. I would agree with everyone in the comments here. A lot of the stuff I'm seeing and that we've talked about, as Michael said, has been coming for years. It's nothing new. We've known we need to be lean and intentional about what we're doing. It's just, again, forcing us to do it. I also agree there's positivity to this. It has been broken for a long time. Let's do it. Let's make some changes. Let's look at the regulations and see how we can do things better. Let's all push back. Yes, if there's no PK available, it's easy to prove it. We'll give you a sample. There's nothing in there. That's what I'm saying. Make this about science. Make it what we're supposed to be doing. Good science, better, and we all need it. So it's a positive thing in the end to do better research.
I agree with you there, Taya.
Yeah, I agree with what everyone has already added, and I think really I would add to lean in on your relationships. We are a very tight-knit community in clinical research. We all know each other. We've all worked with each other at some point. And I think the companies, too, are going to have to start leaning in on each other and sharing responsibilities. And we're going to see much more collaboration. And so I see it as a positive. I see the opportunities there.
And I would add leading into the relationships with the patients and building that out, because as we all know with Consuli, there is that idea of a patient having agency over that data and being able to distribute that data on their own. Elizabeth, I'll go to you, and then we'll close out with Michael.
Sure. I think we're at a grand design challenge moment, as I mentioned in my opening remarks. I agree that there's a lot of the necessity being the mother of all inventions, and that there are some mothers in this, right? So I appreciate Michael's thought. In general, there are incredible new innovations that are emerging. It is important that the research enterprise evolve. I will just nod that as Jennifer articulated, the point about the silver lining of the larger organizations declining studies and being, because they're pricing them correctly and they're therefore unaffordable to sponsors, I think is a reckoning. So we need to sort of deal with the efficiency component. I worry that, forcing a widening to other community organizations that don't yet understand the cost and A, can't invest in innovation at the same level, and B, might not have the ability to cost shift to other programs, and sort of have the financial staying power and be vulnerable as an organization themselves. I'm thinking about like qualified clinics and sort of these sites that are designed to push that. And then also fourth, kind of have, or I say D, have more vulnerable patients that may not have the staying power to persist, and also may not have the same proper pushback on fairness. So, I do think that this sort of equation of getting the financials right is important. Some of that getting driven by efficiency, some of that being driven by the regulatory, adjustments, all in the spirit, though, of like truly addressing the research enterprise and getting this to a more reciprocal, fair deal for everyone.
And Michael?
So, first of all, I think this has been a great discussion, and I think we've all been very civil about what it is that's in front of us. It's, it does cut literally to the heartstrings on a lot of this. As we've discussed, budget cuts in clinical research can significantly hinder the rate of innovation by reducing the number of drug candidates that actually get into development. It's going to slow down the clinical trial progress that we've achieved so far. Limiting research into promising new therapies, and potentially discouraging investment in early stage research. That's something that we saw, at the JPM meeting. There just wasn't a lot of money flowing for early stage projects. Ultimately, if this leads to fewer new drugs reaching the market and impacting patient care in a negative fashion, that's not a good thing. So we've all, just as we've said here, we've all got to work together to try and make this. Now, those of you who know me know that I spend a lot of my world in the rare disease side of things. And I think that what we've talked about today may disproportionately affect rare disease research. And that's where the decision process on the part of the sponsors may lean towards doing the most for the larger populations and affected patients because there's more money in it, and versus the tiny groups of 10 to 1,000 patients. So I just want to make a plug that given that we will celebrate Rare Disease Day tomorrow, Friday, the 28th of February, this is very, very poignant. It's the 28th, and normally the leap year, because it's the rarest day of the year. I'd ask you to think about those small populations and what we need to do by fixing the drug development process that doesn't leave them out. So thanks.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate that as a rare disease patient. And I'm going to throw in a little plug myself on Rare Disease Day. Tomorrow, I'll be broadcasting how I've been using my data and what we're working on kind of as a side conversation. So look forward to that. But thank you all for joining us in this discussion on how funding cuts are disrupting the landscape of clinical trial operations. We've heard valuable insights from our panel and participants highlighting the significant impacts on research progress, patient care, and operational strategies. As we navigate these challenging times, it's clear that collaboration, innovation, and resilience are key to overcoming the obstacles we face. Together, we can find ways to adapt and continue advancing the field of clinical research. In closing, we invite you to engage with us further. If you have suggestions for topics or speakers, or if you're interested in joining us as a guest speaker, please reach out to Maria or any of our team members that you see here. Additionally, we encourage you to explore membership with our sponsor, Consuli, or consider becoming a co-sponsor of this OBQ and other Consuli Conversation Dialogue series. We greatly appreciate your participation and look forward to future conversations. Your insights and engagement make our dialogue richer and more impactful, and we thank you for engaging in the comments. Lastly, we invite you to join the OBQ LinkedIn group to stay up to date on events and interact with other group members. For all these actions, the necessary links and contact information, they will be conveniently available for you in the comments section of this event. And with that, we are going to leave the event open for a couple of minutes, just to give time for people to connect with each other in those comments. We will go back and check through the comments and answer anything that we may not have. So that's it. We have ended our conversation. I want to thank you all for joining us. It is always a pleasure and always fun to be with you guys. And again, thank you all for being engaged.
Thanks, Christine.
You're welcome.
Nice to see everyone.